Is Juneteenth pacification or a holiday that provokes us to become freer? America will co-opt dog shit jam a la lamb and rap brown. Back in May of 2020, after the brutal racist police murder of a black man George Floyd, there were massive protest responses to his murder all over the country. Indeed, protests quickly spread nationally to over 2,000 cities and towns in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. Polls in the summer of 2020 estimated that between 15 million and 26 million people had participated at some point in the demonstrations in the United States. The massive George Floyd protests would become the largest mass protests in U.S. history. Responding to the massive George Floyd protests, the federal government and 30 state governments activated over 96,000 National Guard, State Guard, 82nd Airborne, and 3rd Infantry Regiment. This military deployment, when combined with pre-existing deployments related to the COVID-19 pandemic and other natural disasters, constituted the largest military operation other than war in U.S. history. By the end of June 2020, at least 14,000 people had been arrested. The U.S. government faced the tremendous simultaneous challenge of dealing with the massive George Floyd protests during a massive COVID-19 pandemic. The simultaneous mass outrage and pandemic was very similar to the 1968 massive Black rebellion sweeping America, converging with the massive Vietnam War protests. So the U.S. government created a distraction ploy to pacify Black protesters and Blacks in general with a Juneteenth national holiday proposal. Remind you, the massive George Floyd protests had nothing to do with demanding a national Black holiday. The protest demands were defunding of the police along with major police reforms. In the end, the largest mass protests in U.S. history did not result in no national George Floyd police reform. The mass protests resulted in a national Juneteenth holiday that was never the focus from Jump Street. Many Black activists felt that a federal national Juneteenth holiday was irrelevantly presented as progress while Black people are still being shot down in the streets. It's hard to see a federal Juneteenth holiday as anything more than an attempt to pacify Blacks with the hopes that it will lessen activism and advocacy for major police reform. Imagine after Martin Luther King Jr. led marches in Birmingham, Montgomery, and Selma, Alabama, and throughout the South for years, where Black folks marched and protested. They were arrested, jailed, and murdered, and President Lyndon Johnson told Dr. King, "I'm not going to sign any civil rights and voting rights legislation. Instead, as a substitute, I'm going to sign a bill to make Juneteenth a national holiday." How would Dr. King respond to Johnson? King would say, "Hell no, you're not going to play us. You better sign that civil rights and voting rights legislation." Unlike Dr. King, we went for the okie doke. Instead of demanding and getting a George Floyd national police reform bill, we've settled for a Juneteenth national holiday bill. I want to now focus my attention on Juneteenth. I accept Juneteenth as a national holiday, not as a pacifying substitute for major police reform. I accept the holiday because it represents Black history and it symbolizes the importance of freedom. From June 19th, Juneteenth, our ancestors had been enslaved under the American white supremacy slavery system since 1619, a period of 246 years. From 1865, our ancestors waged a protracted struggle for 100 years to obtain civil rights and voting rights by 1965. What should be clear, after 403 years in America being forcibly enslaved in 1619, we've only had so-called freedom for 57 years, only 14% of the time we've been here. 157 years ago, our enslaved ancestors were informed on June 19, 1865. 2 years late, they were free. If these ancestors could see us now today on June 19, 2022, 157 years later, what conditions would they see the majority of so-called free blacks in? Our ancestors would see black freedom is currently being rolled back by racist voter suppression and the repression of critical race theory. Our ancestors would see blacks across this country where black politicians have for decades neglected black communities. Our ancestors would see blacks across this country where too many black preachers preach the gospel of prosperity, get rich, and not the gospel of freedom, liberation theology. Our ancestors would see blacks across this country where massive amounts of money is being spent on clothes, shoes, jewelry, cars, lottery, etc., and really nothing much is spent on freedom efforts. Our ancestors would see blacks across this country living in neighborhoods that are dominated economically by non-blacks. Our ancestors would see blacks across this country living in neighborhoods where all the schools and community centers are closed. Our ancestors would see blacks across this country where most of the young adults, black and teens, refer to themselves niggas. Our ancestors would constantly see black on violence and murders. Our ancestors would see blacks across this country living in neighborhoods where there are constant funerals, where black folks are dying super disproportionately from major chronic diseases. Our ancestors would see blacks men across this country today on Father's Day where there is a tremendous absence of black fathers in the homes, where black fathers are viewed for the most part as unimportant and expendable. Our ancestors would also see blacks men across this country today on Father's Day where there are large number of black fathers in jail and prisons. In closing, Juneteenth is a holiday based on black freedom. Every year during this holiday time we must focus on our state of freedom, raising the question, what are our current freedom challenges and what must be done to become freer, more self-determined? If we're going to celebrate Juneteenth where the focus is only on food, socializing, and entertainment and not on the theme of freedom and progress, then Juneteenth simply becomes a superficial black version of the 4th of July in June. I end with 2 freedom quotes. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Dr. King, if you can't tell the truth about your situation, why then you don't even deserve freedom. Malcolm X.